so much for having me on the panel. So I think this whole topic is really close to my heart, as I see culture as being successful in all aspects, but especially for data. So I've done over a decade now in products, and I've seen people kind of evangelize about the importance of data and using it effectively in organizations. But often I see a bit of a disconnect about how that materializes in our everyday working practices. And I think it can be really hard to break old habits of kind of top-down, gut-led kind of decision-making and not thinking about how data should really be used. So again, I've seen it, I felt it, I've lived it. And so I really wanted to kind of dive into this. And when I was reflecting and researching ahead of moderating the topic, it seemed that there were a couple of kind of core themes that were coming through about how you build that high performing data culture. So the first one for me was around kind of safety, how safe people feel in organizations to bring data to the table, to challenge each other constructively using data, in essence, our psychological safety. The second one is really around how businesses are using data. So not just simply using data to get windows into organizations. Spoiler, if you're doing that, you're missing a trick. You really want to use it to experiment and hypothesize on what data could predict or the risks that it could help mitigate. So again, how do you extend that use of data? The third one is really around kind of data not being a one team sport. Yes, you have a data team, but what about all of the rest of the teams and how are they using it? And I think that sharing that insights and providing spaces for everyone to play with data is really, really key there. And then fourthly, the other theme that came through, and this feels really personal to me, is making sure that data is rich and human-centered. Like as a product person, I highly index on user research. I love sitting in those spaces where I get to understand how users think and feel. And that for me is just as important as the data points around the way in which users use our products and services. So that combination feels really key. So those were the kind of things that were coming up for me.
Thanks, Sam. Lucinda, talking about creating a culture where people feel safe being challenged. From your experience, when teams do feel psychologically safe, what changes have you seen in how they actually make decisions?
Yes, I think the biggest thing for me and what I see when teams feel psychologically safe is speed and quality. I think teams stop waiting for perfect data or waiting for data to tell a particular story or waiting for permission to act on data. So the teams will start to kind of make informed decisions earlier, and they have the confidence and they're more willing to say that actually this isn't working, this data isn't quite correlating with or proving or disproving our hypothesis, which actually reduces risk rather than increasing it, because you know that the teams are really exploring the data and getting into the crux of what it's telling them, and they don't feel scared to share what the data is actually showing us. So it kind of moves teams from being defensive around data to actually using data to make decisions. And so they're not protecting themselves, protecting others, or protecting ideas. They're genuinely trying to get the best outcome for the users and for the business as well. I also feel that teams feel more collaborative. I feel like there's more of a connection between teams. I feel they're happier. People are happier in teams where there's psychological safety, but because they feel safe to share. There isn't that feeling of hesitancy when it comes to opening up about data or just being honest about data. And I think that's the most important part, actually. It's being able to work together as a team and having that openness as well.
Thanks, Lucinda. And I think Seb talked quite practically about an example of how you create that psychological safety and how you create communication like between teams as well. Unfortunately, it's not with us today. So I thought I would see if any of you had any examples about how you do that in practice. One of the examples which Seb talked about was calling out the type of feedback like you're delivering. So whether that is data, that is experience or opinion. So do any of you have any similar practices that you've put in place, or any examples of how in practice you've created an environment where people really understand like what you're trying to kind of get to and how you're doing that?
There's one thing I do, because I think even before you can get to the point of sharing feedback, is people have to speak the same language. And I mean almost literally. So I do workshops to try and understand the culture gap. It's a really fantastic book called The Culture Gap, but there's cultures which are very like high nuance, like the English, and cultures which are very, very low nuanced, like the Germans or the Americans. So I might say, well, that's interesting. And what I actually mean is that's terrible. But what an American or a German person might hear is, that is actually really interesting. They want to see more of it. So I'd run this exercise with teams, like every time we spin up a new team, we understand how we communicate, and then we really understand, like, what am I saying and how is it going to be heard? And I think that's a really good grounding for giving high quality feedback.
Yeah, I think it really removes misinterpretation there, because when you said that, I was like, that's interesting. You can take that like two ways.
Yes.
Jane, actually, on your point, you mentioned, like, on the evening, I suppose the risk when making assumptions in
Yes.
an enterprise environment, and like what the barrier to taking risk is there. Could you tell us a little bit about how your environment, working in those enterprise environments, how that would differ and how you need to evaluate the risk you're able to take?
Yes, I do a lot of work, a lot of meetings and discussing with our clients and trying to understand how they operate. I should say I'm from Contentsquare, which is why I'm really interested in how people operationalize data and decision making. So I've done a huge amount of research in this space. And I think some of the barriers to this sort of fast decision making, or some of this like fear of doing things, is in a really complex enterprise organization, it's really hard to understand the second order effects of what you do in a squad. So you might change something, and then you might be doing something like causing problems with compliance or legal, or there might be another team that's causing this, so these things magnify, and people get really scared, and they're scared of being blamed, because sometimes these consequences are really, really serious. So what I've seen work really well is like small bets, clear guardrails, having faster feedback loops. And I had this wonderful quote from a client saying, something's good enough to try and safe enough to fail. I think that's a really, really good guardrail. So trying to do, like, call out your assumptions up first, understand, like, what's your risks, try and mitigate the risks, and then do small, fast experiments to smaller groups of people. And I think that's a really good way to try and minimize the risk and make people start to feel comfortable with things failing. And then also removing that culture of blame. I think that's something we talked a lot about in the night, is if you experiment, they have to fail. Some of them have to fail, otherwise you're not learning anything. So reframing something as failure, something as a learning, is another cultural change I've seen work really well.
Nice. I think it's so important to consider different environments, because what I found quite interesting on the evening, there was some of you who saw it as an absolute luxury to have a data team, for example, coming from those really early stage startups all the way through to working in really established teams. So I think having that and when risks are higher, that confidence, I can understand why it would be a big move for people to take those risks and experiment. So I think it's like culturally internally, but also culturally kind of like with your clients as well, isn't it? One of the other, like, kind of leading on from reporting into experimentation, Tal, you said that experimentation needs to be built into how organizations operate. So do you have any examples of like what that looks like practically?
Hi, great to be here, by the way. Thanks. Yes, I think having experimentation building into the product operational model, means from the foundation and then through processes and into ritual that you have all the right systems in place so that your organization can be data driven and experimentation driven. So I think that actually it starts with the infrastructures and the tools, and they lead to data culture and not necessarily the other way around. So investing in infrastructure, the right data architecture, clean data schemes, reliable event tracking, proper logging and tracing, all of those things this is the basics. And without that, you can't build processes on top if you don't have that. So I think you have that as a first step, and then you have processes, and that means experimentation becomes part of the development cycle itself. So any feature or that we ship or we iterate on, it comes with the test that we run, and there's a playbook or a workflow that we already know how to follow that starts with defining what the hypothesis and what we measure and the guardrails and how we conclude an experiment. And it means that we also have the tools to automate and run these tests. So in organizations where it's really built into the operational model, there's a lot of autonomy for teams to do these things. I think once, if you need a data scientist to do something and wait 2 weeks for it to write an experiment, the likelihood of you doing that experiment is very small. So I think these are the kind of foundations on it. And on top of it, there's also then kind of socializing the results. So sharing what we've learned in squad meetings and others, and turning those tests back into stories and narratives of our users and about our. I just want to relate to what Jane said before. It's, I think, quite a convention, or at least from big organizations that really excel in the experimentations like Booking.com or Netflix, that about 80% of experiments fail, okay? And what that means is that you need to have those systems to do experimentations in scale, because you need enough volume in order to start doing that in a meaningful way. And I think that a lot of the time we're too focused on the conversation around build velocity, and it will be interesting to start talking in terms of experimentation velocity, because it's actually a metric or an indicator of our learning pace. And experimentation velocity is achieved once you have those infrastructure processes, built it into the development cycle, and so.
To build on that, I think it's not even just experimentation velocity, it's decision velocity, because sometimes you can make a decision without doing an experiment, and that's why data is really, really important. So are you making the right decisions, or are you sort of panicking or waiting a long time to make a decision, or waiting for a very senior person to make a decision, or are the teams feeling confident and having enough data or being able to back that up with an experiment to make really fast, good quality decisions? I think decisions are so interesting because that's the purpose of data, really. Is not just something you have, it's a fuel for you to make a really good business decision and then to grow and learn.
Seb mentioned about like planning outcomes before testing as well. So leading on from that, how do you think that would benefit? And have any of you got any similar experiences of implementing that within your teams?
Planning for outcomes. So when you experiment, part of that process is trying to having an hypothesis of what you think might happen or not. Going back to what Jane said about the balance of reducing risk and making those experiments very agile, small, you can learn fast, then you can introduce a change, then you can iterate, you can roll out to have a proper rollout plan, and those mechanisms in place helps with that, I think. Or this is one approach.
Absolutely. I think hypothesis-led design, from the moment you're trying to design or define something, understanding what problem that design or that experience should be solving. Like, why are the team even working on this? So you should have a theory about why they're doing this, or like, we're expecting to see this amount of uplift, or we're expecting to see this reduction in failure rate, and you should then use that as a basis for your experiment. So is it really going to result in less people contacting a helpline, or are people really more likely to complete their end-to-end funnel or shopping bag? So you need to know, and I think that has instills disciplines in the teams right from the start. When you're deciding to do something, there has to be a business value to it, or a user value. You have to define what that is, and then sometimes you could just ship it if it's small and see what's happening, or sometimes you could do an experiment and validate and iterate, as Tal says. But if you haven't got the infrastructure of thinking about your work in terms of, this is a risk, this is a hypothesis, this is an assumption, this is how I'm going to validate it, then you're kind of just sort of throwing designs and work into the wind. So I think it's really important to have a really disciplined product and design and development process. And data and experimentation is part of this process.
I'd second that. I think it's important that testing everything doesn't mean that you have to slow down. And one of the things that I encourage in my teams is you can test through products. You can do things like A/B testing, which you can test different segments, and you can learn during that kind of implementation phase. It doesn't have to be kind of, let's do this huge qualitative research project before we implement anything. So there's different ways that you can actually approach experimentation, which means you don't actually slow down, but you learn whilst you're developing. So sometimes we implement dual track agile, where we do an experimentation and implementation at the same time. So I think that's worked very well. But I think, coming to the crux of what you said, Jane, it's important that you have a shared goal. And if you understand what that goal is and it has a business value or user value, then there's a plethora of experimentations you can do to try and understand, okay, is this proving or disproving my hypothesis, and where do we go from here? Because if you don't have that, then you're kind of it's the blind leading the blind. You don't know what direction you're going in, and you don't know what success looks like. So you don't know if actually that experiment is going to bring you closer or further from the goal. So I think that's definitely second what you said there, Jane.
Sam, on the evening, asked a key question in the meetup about what gets in the way of product design and data all working well together. Big question. Jane, one of the things which you mentioned is you highlighted that data teams are quite overloaded and often can't work as strategic partners. So how do we mitigate that? How do we enable that relationship to work better?
A lot of self-serve tools, I think. That's something that we're working on at Contentsquare, trying to democratize data, make our tools really easy to use for less data savvy personas, making things really visual and easy to understand, trying to build in guardrails so that you don't have false positives or people make decisions on partial data. It's very interesting designing to make sure that people are able to self-serve. So I think that's one thing. And then also just trying to help people understand what the data team can do, make them more of a strategic partner rather than a reporting partner. So I think a lot of it comes back to training and to self-serve and to tool quality and to data quality, and then also to an appreciation in the team about what the data team can actually achieve if they're not just there sort of serving. So I think maybe having a ladder so you can self-serve, maybe there's some office hours you can check in. That's something I've seen really worked. And then you can ask if you've sort of exhausted the other ways of getting the information. And then, as Tal was saying, having really standard data sets, definitions, descriptions of what the data is actually telling you, labeling, sort of the hierarchy of the data, naming conventions. That's really important as well. So people were able to compare apples to apples. And then helping people just, as I said, just train them in what data means, help people think about things in terms of a hypothesis. And then also giving data, making sure that they're listened to, that they're able to be part of executive conversations and that they can influence and they can describe what's happening. And I think this is becoming even more important now. Everything I've said is we're starting to use AI to build products. At Contentsquare, we're from product design to development, or from an idea through to an experiment at the site. We're now looking at how we can automate. But you can't really do this unless you have really good data sets internally. You have ways to automate. You have a really good sort of system that is end to end. So it's important for data, but it unlocks AI.
If I can jump into that, I think that the very job definition of data team is changing from being a kind of reporting factory or service providers to be those who shape those platforms and build them, build the rails, are responsible for the quality so that everyone in the organization can trust the data that they're saying, and responsible for enablement. So I think that the role of the data team is increasingly going towards that, and towards making sure that about 80% of data needs are self-served. And that people are trained and coached and they're using in the correct way. And absolutely with AI, it's possible, because AI became what AI did. I mean, AI in a more traditional sense of machine learning, did many things up until this point, but I think the real innovation is it became a data workflow accelerator, and made it possible to do things at scale exactly because of that. So now you have tools where PMs can query data in a natural language, and AI can even suggest segmentation and suggest guardrails and suggest the metrics and stuff like that. And we're going more and more towards this kind of capabilities, and does a lot of the statistical heavy lifting, so that data teams kind of become the managers of the operators of this system, and coaches of the rest of the team along the way. And it also means that it frees their time so that they can, the 20% that remains is the hard questions, right? That are more difficult to tackle, like more complicated methodologies or different or interactions of different tests and stuff like that. So yeah, so I think it's an interesting evolution of the whole operation of both data teams and product teams, I think.
But Lucinda, we've kind of touched on this a little bit already with Jane kind of talking about language, but you talked about like having shared language and shared goals. So talk to us a little bit about that, and do you think that is I suppose why potentially like data teams aren't used to that kind of like work with for their full potential, because they're, you know, people don't have that goal, that language to be able to communicate effectively and get the most out of them?
Yeah, I think for me, shared language, shared goals are more important than shared tools, essentially. I think for me, I focus on getting everyone aligned on the same 3 questions. I said this on the night. What's happening? Why is it happening? And so what? And all teams need to kind of hone in on those 3 questions and anchor conversations around those questions. So you stop kind of miscommunicating with each other, misunderstanding exactly what you're trying to achieve, because you're consistently asking the same questions throughout the teams. And I think that goes for data, product design. They need to have that. They need to be collective around those 3 questions. And when I say kind of shared goals over tools, I think if product design data are all measured against the same OKRs, they're all working towards the same goal and OKRs, collaboration really improves almost by default, because you're all working to the same goal, you're all speaking the same language, you're all asking the same questions, and doing that collaboratively and inter-team. So I think if you're doing that, almost certainly you'll have that alignment, and then you're building products that everyone understands direction, and you start to understand your users throughout the whole organization, which I think can only be for good. It can only be a positive thing.
And when it comes to I suppose combining both qualitative and quantitative insight, that was the 4th theme and our kind of final theme of the evening. Tal, you kind of you spoke a little bit on I suppose how people can dismiss like qualitative data as like fluffy. So what is the most effective way to kind of like shift that mindset, and to why is it important that it's not seen in that way?
Yeah, so I would challenge the definition of qual as fluffy. Qual is data, and in fact it's often high density data that contains a lot of information about our users and their context and the business, and therefore potentially a very high value data, even if it's a small sample. So in terms of changing the mindsets, I would say do qual seriously, right? So there's also ways of use the right methodologies, take it seriously, be with your users where they are, surface that to the rest of the organization, but also translate it the same as with any other data. Qual data is also translatable into an hypothesis, something that is testable, something that you can connect and connect to results. In the end of the day, it's a story, right? That we found out through conversations about something in the user experience, and that now we can test and see if it makes an impact. So that would be my way, just doing it seriously in the same way that we treat quantitative data. I'll just say that I think that this the dichotomy is tricky, and we need to be also careful not to focus too much. When we focus too much on qualitative data, can be a kind of danger of slipping into marginal optimization of metrics that can be sometimes vanity metrics, but where it's easy to iterate again and again and optimize like little things. But a lot of the big breakthroughs come from those qualitative research, and often they show us the way of what else is possible, rather than like iterating on what we already know. That's my take on it.
Big plus one to that, Tal. You know, like data is, it's showing what's happening or what has happened on your product. It's the past, is the future, I think, and I completely agree. You need to use qual and quant at the right time and the right part of the process. So using qual, you might have a prototype, you might show that to 9 people, or you might go and do some contextual inquiry, or you really understand their underlying needs and the jobs they have to do. That allows you to innovate. And simply doing quant on things that have happened means, as Tal said, you end up in a local maxima, optimizing checkout flows rather than completely reimagining what the product could do. So I think you need both, and you need to make sure that you have a product and design lifecycle that allows for both. And actually, AI is making it a lot easier because now we're doing much faster prototypes. We're getting things into the hand of the user much faster that actually has real data in rather than just a flat screen, which allows us to get better feedback. And it also, that means it's a cost saver because we don't build things until we're a bit more certain that this is something that's going to work rather than just shipping and hoping, or even shipping and experimenting. But trying to put qual early in the process allows you to innovate, de-risk some of your delivery, and it gets you out that local maxima. So I think you need both.
I think the other thing I'd add, I completely agree with everything Tal and Jane have said, is that, and I had to remind a founder of this one day who was really obsessed with the numbers, is that you and I create meaning through language. So where would we look for the greatest or one of the most valuable tools of meaning? Through the language and through the way in which people describe things back to us. Yes, it can feel harder. I'm thinking I'm old enough to kind of remember pre-AI and having to look through scripts and kind of highlight bits and pieces and themes that were coming through. Yes, I'm that old. But there's a richness there that you get that's just as valuable as understanding some of those more kind of hard data pieces.
You all mentioned on the evening, I suppose the kind of real takeaway for me was like the being able to kind of like build data into a culture is around kind of, making sure that people actually feel really confident, actually really comfortable, and it's part of like, your rituals as a team. So do you have any examples of like rituals which you've embedded within your teams which you think have really worked, any socials, anything like that which people could take away and try?
Yeah, there's one that I used to use with a team, which was around kind of doing a little exercise each week as a group. So what was your win, what was your miss, and what was your aha moment? So it kind of normalizes that winning, which you kind of want a high performing team to do. It normalizes the failure as well. What didn't work so well? Tell us about it, share it. What can we all learn? And what was your aha? What was your insight? What did you gain? What did you learn this week? And it really forced people to know every Friday we're going to have this conversation. So have a little think about what's gone on for you. Really small, but it just started to develop that mindset for that team.
We do things like celebrate really good questions rather than really good answers, help people sort of shape questions, or thinking about how they've made a better question. We do little sessions on things like how to avoid selection bias or correlation versus causation. So we do little drop-in training sessions. And we do cinema sessions, so you can watch session replays, or we have share backs about what people are actually doing on the site. And we also try and get people across the org to be involved in user research. We have engineers doing user research, which is really, really powerful, I think. And then the whole team becomes really focused on the customer and they really understand what the customer needs. And as you said, Sam, in the customer's own words. So there's lots of like little moments we do. But I think for me, the favourite one is making sure that everybody gets access to a customer and everybody talks to a customer and owns and participates in that research and understands what a good question is and how to answer it.
So we had some questions from our attendees on the evening. Now, we might have covered them in the conversation slightly already, but we'll go through them and see if there's any kind of like key points that any of you feel like you can really add to that as well. So one of the questions was, how do you reduce dependency on data teams without lowering quality?
Yeah, so like I said, I think the data team job is changing towards enablement and the democratization of data needs, whether it's analysis or ability to run tests and so on. And I think this is truly the main way, right? You make it possible for any PM or growth or marketer to run an experiment, click of a button, and most of the time that they need, and then you build the right coaching and training around that. And it's true that it takes an initial investment in these things and integrating new tools, fixing them when they're broken in the beginning. Suddenly you realize that you need to clean your data because you have 5 different definitions to a certain metric, and so you go through this initial pain, I think, but eventually it's the only way that you can scale. So I think
Yeah, agreed. So you
The
need,
main way in which it's done. Another thing is that once the experimentation and so on is part of the development cycle product, you do end up, you do speak the same language, okay? So it's not that product speaks one language and then data science speaks a foreign dialect that no one understands, right? So you end up telling the same story, and then you don't build big gaps of knowledge, because you work together and you close those knowledge gaps on the spot, rather than having every 3 months a big workshop. Workshops are also good, yeah, but coaching that is more organic and ongoing, I think, is also important for that.
And I think it's I can imagine a lot of people who are listening to this are coming up against a lot of pushback around actually being able to invest in building a data culture, invest in those tools, or like building out that infrastructure, or even like just a pushback around that their ability to communicate and build that kind of culture out. So if we're looking at people who they can only control what they can control, think like what are like behaviors which you see that often like undermine like data cultures, and what to be like mindful for if you're not able to make these big kind of changes? How do you gradually start making those changes?
one thing I've seen is the sort of hippo culture, highest paid person in the organisation. There's some people, managers I've seen, I think I talked about this on the night, they're almost addicted to decision making, because it's kind of, they feel that this is their job, and it's another sort of more senior person's equivalent of micromanaging. So I think if you've got one of those people, they don't want to be outsourcing the decision making, because they see that as their job. But there has to be some way for you to kind of get control. So maybe it's like small bets or some ways to bring that person on the journey, so that they understand that there's democratizing decision making actually sort of scales their influence, rather than sort of hanging on to it. So I think that's definitely, there's a human factor to it.
I think the main thing that undermines a healthy data culture is when data is weaponized. And I see it time and time again when data is used in a negative lens. So this metric is X and it was unexpected. And there's kind of like if there's a blame culture, people start to kind of shy away from having a data culture. And this kind of speaks to what we were talking about earlier around psychological safety and having safety around having honest conversations around data. So I think it's about learning. And if you frame data as learning, then it's always going to create a healthy data culture. I think if it's framed in a different way, in a more negative light, then it will kind of tarnish your hopes of having a healthy data culture, for sure.
Thanks. I just remembered what I was going to say. My brain's obviously too full at the moment. The other thing is risk. Like, it's actually, I'm always astounded at companies that just ship things with no research. Like, it's a massive risk. So if it can be turned around from you're not spending money on like data and analytics tools and research, what you're actually doing is saving the company money in the long run by making sure those very, very expensive dev teams are going to work on things that really move the needle, or things that really innovate, or things that help you win, rather than just pushing things out into the world and you don't know if it worked or not. So I think changing it from spending money to saving money is a really good technique to get buy-in from senior executives.
I think one of the last questions, which I think we have touched on, but I think it would be quite interesting to perhaps rephrase this. So it's, how do you build data literacy without overwhelming teams? So I can imagine that there's probably quite a lot of people listening to this and thinking like, this is huge. Like, where do we even start? So if you were talking to those people, do any of you have any tips on like how to actually get started and how to start introducing that?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit to this. I started within an organisation that kind of was using different kind of methodologies that I wasn't so aware of. And during my onboarding, I was told to kind of go and look at the Confluence. Thousands and thousands of pages have been written, and I was looking at the data, and no one was looking at them. No one was using them or reading them, and this one person had just been churning them out. And I kind of reflect on what my business studies GCSE teacher told me around just-in-time manufacturing, just-in-time learning. You need to do the learning in the moment that you're going to apply it. Otherwise, for me personally, it doesn't stick. So what I think could have been better, and what I think that you can do when you're trying to improve your data literacy, is small little projects, small moments where you can kind of build things in. Again, it comes back to that culture. Have you got a culture where you can kind of tap someone in the shoulder, hey, have you got 5 minutes? I'm just trying to deal with this. Someone who has different expertise to you, and really trying to, in the moment, learn and up your data literacy. I would stress it's not easy and depends on lots of other factors in terms of how much runway you have, how much pressure you're under, like all those things can really impact that. But I think if you can create spaces where those moments can happen, but they're also celebrated as a business as well, then you start to really see the change as well.
I think so. And I keep banging on about this, but I think it's not about teaching people data, it's about teaching people how to make good decisions. Making a good decision means that you need evidence, you need to understand the context of that decision, you need to understand why you would do this, because there'd be a metric attached or a North Star matrix. So all of this, I think, is teaching people how to do good product delivery and making good decisions, and you can't make a good decision without data. So you're then seeing, rather than data being something over there that you have to learn, it's an integral part of your job. And start small, and then help people understand some, as I said, some common traps about things like, correlation versus causation. You could have like a sort of very simple page for that, some principles about decision making which are connected to data, and then just do it in the flow of the work. Have little coaching sessions, to start small, have like office hours for the data team, maybe paired analysis sessions where you match somebody that's kind of knows what they're doing with somebody who's just starting out. And then celebrating the behavior. This is a great question. We had made a really great decision. Tell stories about it, and then maybe even start with one team. This is something I always try to do when changing a culture, but start with one exemplar team and support them to do it really well, and then get them to talk about it, and then everybody then sees the purpose of what it is you're talking about. They see that it's easy, they see that this other team's celebrated. So get the other team to be the ambassador for you, and then share that knowledge throughout the rest of the organisation.
I think they both give really good examples of just how to think about this huge topic and just kind of get going on it. And I think a lot of it, like we kind of started the conversation around that if you are one person coming up against a large organization which perhaps isn't working in that way, or you're in a startup, it just gives you that kind of first step to try things out and to be able to do that in your workflow and then build from there. So to close us out, the final theme, AI and data cultures. So we almost had a full house when it came to the opinion that AI will increase the likelihood of developing a true data culture in organizations. Apart from Seb, he was on the fence. I won't say he was no, but he was on the fence. He's not with us today, so we'll have to follow up on his opinion on that. But obviously, Sam, we didn't get your opinion on this. So we'll start with Jane, Lucinda and Tal. You were all on the increase side of the debate. So would you like to share with us your opinions on that?
Yes, so I think AI's it's going to be the superpower for analytics. But as Tal was saying, you have to have the foundations right. You have to have proper data governance, proper structure, proper naming. Otherwise, you're going to get lots of confident nonsense from the machine. But what it does do is, I think we're building a tool where you can just ask a question and then you get evidence and you get understanding, and you'll be able to ask those questions in natural language. I think we're going to see more of this. It's really, really exciting. And the other thing I think AI is really going to help with is from idea to action or idea to experiment. So it's not just about data, it's about the entire end-to-end workflow of building products, and data is part of that. And then data will help you understand your experiments and then help you understand what you should put live. So I think data is not just something over there to do with AI. Data is foundational to AI working. And also data is foundational to the new end-to-end AI-powered workflows.
Thanks, Jane.
On my side, I think AI lowers the barrier to entry as well for teams. So if there are teams that don't have large data teams that are able to kind of churn out all of these experiments, etc., it just means the whole organization can actually interrogate the data using AI. They can explore patterns. They can learn how to ask better questions or how to design better prompts without needing kind of deep technical data skills, which I think is really important, especially if you're a small startup and you want the team to kind of be knowledgeable about this. The risk of that, of course, I'm still on the increase side. The risk of that, is just blind trust. We know that there are hallucinations when using AI tools, but I think it's just remembering that critical thinking is also important. So going over the kind of analysis and not just blindly leading what AI is kind of telling you. I think that's just that caveat, but I do think it's going to increase having a really healthy data culture in organizations.
Thanks, Lucinda. Tal?
Yeah. So again, AI is not new, right? AI already brought us closer into the light in terms of understanding our products and our users, and it will continue to do that. And we're moving towards a world where eventually we'll be looking at self-optimizing and self-healing products, and I will be suggesting hypotheses and going deeper and deeper into what currently we do. Yeah, right, as product leaders. And going back to what I think was touched on many times, and I think that was also Seb's point in the panel, data health is everything in that sense, and it becomes the only way to unlock that value would be taking care of that. And the biggest assets organizations will be their own data and the data of their users, and their ability to adopt and integrate in a clever way those tools, technologies, and so on.
Thanks, Tal. Sam, where do you land on this? Because we didn't hear your opinion.
Yeah, I'd say I'm probably closer to Seb in terms of his perspective here. So I think hearing Lucinda in particular, it's kind of it depends kind of answers. I know it's such a cop out, but for me, AI could have the potential to kind of reduce a lot of that hands-on exploration. You mentioned it, Lucinda, about critical thinking. So a lot of what I'm doing is using AI to supplement some of that so that I can get faster to the bit that I know I need to get into, getting under the surface of that problem to come up with better solutions. I'd say as well, I'm really curious, and I believe AI will get better at this, but if we think about how AI kind of gathers the data, the fastest and easiest answer isn't always the right answer. And I feel like it will increase in sophistication and we will get there. But right now, I'm curious about like true data holding themselves and the data to the highest possible standard in terms of what they're evaluating from that. So I understand how compelling those AI insights can be to us. They give us nice, short, easy, digestible bits of information, but sometimes the complexity is important. And I think that we may lose that potentially. Yeah, so I'm sort of on the fence, I guess, if you could say that.
Did you feel pressured into that answer? Because
a little bit, yeah.
You needed to be disagreeable in a way. I just want to say a huge thank you to all of you for both like joining on the evening and joining today. Like it's, everything is a complete give back within products, so it's so invaluable, like your opinions, your investment in time, and I know that so many of our community members really enjoyed the evening. So, and thank you to the community for really shaping the conversation. If you're at the meetup, then we hope that this brought everything back to life and a little bit of a reminder after the Christmas period where I'm sure everyone switched off. And if you didn't manage to come along, and then we'd love to see you at the next In Product Meetup. All the kind of topics that we talk about. We're just really trying to get into like the depths of like real day-to-day workings from our speakers. Really appreciative to all of you. Thank you all so much for your time that you've invested.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for setting these events up. It's brilliant. I'm so glad to be involved.
Thanks, Sadie.
Thank you.